Waycrest Manor returns as one of the new dungeons for Mythic Plus in Season 3. The dungeon will start with a 39-minute timer, so as long as you complete the dungeon within that window, you will upgrade your key. At the start of the dungeon, you'll encounter soul essences. These normal mobs will spam cast Scar Soul on random players, dealing a burst of shadow damage, interrupt or stun the pack to avoid them ganging up on one player. As you make your way to the first boss we'll be covering in this guide, the Heartsbane Triad, you'll encounter a few different types of mobs. Enthralled guards will attack the tank with Focused Strike, dealing physical damage, so use mitigation here. Bewitched captains have a frontal cone attack and shadow cleave. Be sure to dodge this, but more importantly they have a cast that needs interrupting named Spirited Defense. If this cast is successful, it will apply an aura to the whole group, reducing all incoming damage to the affected mobs by 50%. Note that this aura is purgeable if it does go off. You may find two types of witches here depending on which one spawns. Heartsbane Runeweavers will cast a heavy hitting channel through Etch. If targeted, make sure to pop a defensive here to live. Classes like Hunters and Rogues that can drop combat can stop this channel. They will also cast Runic Mark on a random player, dealing ticking shadow damage and exploding upon expiration. Heartsbane Soul Charmers will repeatedly cast Soul Bolt, but note that your higher priority interrupt will be on the Soul Volley. If this cast is successful, it will deal heavy damage to your whole party. This Soul Charmer will also place down Warding Candles. These candles reduce the damage taken by enemies while they stand within the zone, so tanks make sure to kite out of these. Runic Disciples will cast Runic Bolt at random players, dealing upfront shadow damage. More importantly, you must make sure to interrupt their Spellbind cast. This deals damage but silences the affected player for 5 seconds. It can be dispelled if it's not on your healer, as it's classed as a magic effect. In the room that the Triad resides in, you'll see 2 different packs on each side of the room. Feel free to clear these mobs to make sure you don't ninja pull during the boss encounter. Each pack will consist of Thistle Acolytes that have 2 interruptible casts. Bone Splinter deals damage to a random player and applies a 10-second debuff that deals moderate ticking damage. Drain Essence is their second cast that channels onto the target, dealing substantial damage over its 8-second duration. Both of these casts should be interrupted as much as possible. The Blight Toads in these packs will attack the tank with Blighted Lick, dealing a small amount of magic damage. Upon dying, these toads will leave a large patch on the ground from their Toad Blight cast. 4 seconds after, this patch will explode, so players should be sure to avoid the swirlies. The Heartsbane Triad is the first boss that we'll encounter. During this fight, you must fight 3 different bosses simultaneously. These bosses do not share their health pool and have an Ironbark Shield passive, reducing the damage they take substantially. Each boss can only take damage when they are holding the focusing iris, and they will take turns claiming the iris and will drop it after taking damage equal to 50% of their health. During this period, players should focus single target damage into that sister. Whilst the boss holds the focusing iris, they need to be tanked, and they also gain access to new abilities. Each sister has her own unique set of abilities and also auras. Selena will reduce the healing done by all players by 50% with her aura of apathy. Milady has the aura of Dread, applying a stacking dot on all players while they are stationary, so be sure to keep moving. And finally, Sister Briar has the aura of Thorns, dealing physical damage to players whenever she is struck. Sister Selena starts with the Iris and she will spam cast Soul Bolt, dealing a moderate burst of damage to a random player. This cast, along with the Ruinous Bolt and Bramble Bolt cast from the other sisters, are interruptible and they cast constantly during the fight. Your interrupt should be prioritized on the boss holding the Iris. Selena, while active, will also gain access to soul manipulation, mind controlling a player until the player reaches 50% health. The rest of the DPS should quickly swap to the mind control player and burst them down. Do be wary not to hit them too hard, especially with dots, as they will remain on the player. During this, Selena gains soul armor, reducing her damage taken by 99%, so this is even more reason to burst down your teammate quickly. When Sister Milady picks up the Iris, she gains access to the Runic Mark ability, dealing ticking damage to all players and causing each player to explode after 6 seconds. When it expires, it will deal damage to all players within 6 yards. During this time, make sure that your whole party is spread from each other. Note this debuff is a curse, so can be dispelled, but it still explodes, so make sure the dispelled player is away from the group. Sister Briar will gain access to Jagged Nettles when she claims the Iris. This cast deals a moderate burst of physical damage to a player and applies a ticking debuff which deals heavy ticking damage. To remove this debuff, the player must be healed above 90% HP. Healers should quickly spot heal this debuff and the affected player should use a defensive. If any of the bosses reach 100% energy, they will cast Dire Ritual, dealing a near lethal amount of damage to all players before resetting their energy to 0. Players should aim to defeat the bosses before any of their energy reaches 100%, but failing to do so, everybody should pop a defensive to live the cast. Upon defeating the Heartsbane Triad, you'll make your way to the central courtyard where you'll find the Soulbound Goliath. But first, you'll have to take on some new mobs. Coven Thornshapers will target a randomly selected player with Uproot. placing a patch of roots under the player, dealing damage and knocking them up upon spawning. This patch deals ticking damage and slows you by 50%, so make sure to step out of it. Infected Thorn is a single target cast on a random player that deals moderate upfront damage and leaves a nasty disease dot on the player that can be dispelled, though players should make sure to kick this. Thorn Guards will hit the tank with Tearing Strike, dealing physical damage and applying a 6-second bleed. Tanks should prepare mitigation for these bleeds. Additionally, Thorn Guards will cast Enrage, buffing their damage dealt by 25% for 10 seconds. This buff needs to be soothed off to help out your tank. Upon dying, the Thorn Guard will shatter, creating a deadly zone that deals a burst of damage and leaves a 5-second dot on players struck. Jagged Hounds are found in this courtyard in groups. Apart from melee attacking, they will also Thorn Claw the tank, dealing moderate physical damage. Tanks be very wary in this area. Just before reaching the second boss, you'll find a mini boss named Matron Brindle. Be careful pulling this mob as it's very easy to ninja pull the actual boss. The Matron will channel Thorn Barrage into the tank, dealing hefty physical damage over 6 seconds and leaving a debuff that deals ticking damage over 6 seconds. She will also cast Splinter Spike, creating a swirly under each player and erupting a second later. This deals damage and knocks players back if they're caught in it. The Soulbound Goliath. Throughout this encounter, the boss will gain stacks of Soul Harvest every 2 seconds. This effect increases the boss's damage done by 5% and continuously stacks throughout the fight. During the fight, lightning will strike the area and leave behind patches of fire, dealing damage to the players who run into them. However, if the Goliath is moved into these patches, he will light a blaze and gain Burning Rush for 6 seconds. This deals party-wide damage every second, so healers prepare accordingly. It will also trigger Burning Soul Ads to spawn that fixate on random players. If they do connect to the player, they will deal considerable damage to them, so make sure to kite away from them for their 10-second duration. Finally, triggering a Burning Rush will also reset all of his stacks of Soul Harvest, and this is best done at around 10 stacks. The boss will crush the tank, dealing a burst of physical damage, so prepare active mitigation here to cushion the blow, especially if the Goliath has high stacks of Soul Harvest. Lastly, the boss will cast Soul Thorns on a random non-tank player, impaling the player, dealing damage and stunning them until the thorns are killed by other DPS. Players should immediately swap to the Soul Thorns to free the affected player. After taking out the Goliath, you'll proceed towards Raal the Gluttonous. In these hallways, you'll find 3 different trash mobs. Infected peasants are surrounded by groups of 4 or 5 devouring maggots. These peasants themselves are pretty harmless outside of their withering glob cast, dealing nature damage to a random player. The maggots will cast spit at random targets, dealing moderate magic damage and applying a 10-second dot. This can be dispelled. Some of these maggots, however, have the parasitic buff, granting them access to the Infest cast. This causes the maggot to burrow into a player, applying a 10-second dot to them that spawns 2 new maggots after 10 seconds. These new maggots also have a chance to carry the parasitic buff. Infest should be kicked by players as much as possible to prevent being overrun. Gore-stained piglets will attack the tank with Snout Smack, but outside of that, these mobs can generally be ignored. You'll want to clear inside the boss room to avoid ninja pulling during the fight. Pallid Gorges will leap to the furthest target with Ravaging Leap. This will deal damage to the player and apply a 5-second bleed to anybody within 5 yards. The furthest players should ensure they are spread from everybody to keep the bleeds to a minimum. They also have a frontal cast in Wretch. Tanks should make sure to face these mobs away at all times, but feel free to use kicks on the Wretch cast. Banquet Stewards will cast an uninterruptible Dinner Bell, dealing massive damage and silencing all players within 8 yards for 2 seconds, so be sure to stand out of the targeted zone. They will also hit the tank twice with Meaty Rampage. Tanks, just make sure to expect extra incoming damage here. If your group move towards Raal the Gluttonous first from the lobby at the start of the instance, players will encounter another 3 types of mobs through the lounge. Crazed Marksmen prefer to spam shoot random players and will cast Tracking Explosive on a random player. This uninterruptible cast will send a rocket that chases the player and explodes upon impact, dealing damage to anybody within 4 yards. The targeted player should make sure to stay spread from the group. Maddened Survivalists will fire Serving Serpents at the entire group, dealing damage and applying a 6-second disease dot. This cast is a high priority interrupt to ensure the avoidable outgoing damage is kept under control. The Survivalists can also throw out 2 different types of traps at random players. Shrapnel traps will explode when touched, dealing damage to players within 4 yards, whilst the Freezing trap will stun the player for 8 seconds when touched. However, this stun can be dispelled. Diseased Mastiffs will hit the tank with Diseased Crunch, dealing small nature damage to them. Generally, you can ignore these dogs as their lower health pool means they get cleaved down quickly. Raal the Gluttonous. This boss will face a random direction and cast Rotten Expulsion, sending out several bolts that deal a burst of damage to players at the impact zone. Identify which way the boss is facing during the cast and sidestep it. These bolts leave behind a patch of goo that deals ticking damage and slows players by 60%. Bile Oozlings will also spawn from these patches, and when these mobs die, they will cast Bile Explosion. leaving a swirly behind that explodes after a few seconds, dealing big damage to players in the zone. Raal will cast Tenderize at the tank's location, charging up a frontal cone attack that will deal massive damage to players caught in it. Again, look which way he's facing and run to a safe spot. This will happen 3 times back to back, constantly recasting at the tank's location. Tank should pick 2 spots here and move between the 2 so that the rest of the group can easily stay safe. After finishing this series of casts, the boss will then call servants, spawning adds at each of the doors that will slowly move towards Raal to be consumed. If any of the adds are consumed, they will give them a permanent 5% damage increase, so be sure to use CC to slow them down while quickly taking them out. Once you've defeated the first 3 bosses, your group must descend into the manor's cellar. There are 2 entrances to the cellar, but for the sake of this guide, we'll head into the kitchen. Downstairs, you'll fight the second mini-boss, Matron Alma. She will afflict a player with Dreadmark, dealing ticking damage to the player and exploding after 6 seconds. Stay spread during this debuff so that you don't apply lingering dread to your friends. This can be dispelled via a Curse Dispel if somebody receives it. Decaying Touch will be cast on the tank, dealing a large burst of magic damage and applying a 15% damage taken increase debuff that lasts 8 seconds. Make sure to use a defensive cooldown here, especially if tanking multiple enemies with the Matron. Lastly, she will cast Ruinous Volley. Dealing moderate shadow damage to all players, make sure that somebody kicks this cast. Coven Diviners will frequently cast Soul Bolt on a random target, dealing decent shadow damage. They will also apply a Fragment Soul on the tank. Healers should dispel this dot ASAP, as the Diviner's next cast, Consume Fragments, will increase their damage done by 5% per active Fragment Soul debuff on the group. Note this cast can also be kicked. Lord and Lady Waycrest. Initially, you'll only be able to attack Lord Waycrest. He'll hit the tank with Wasting Strike, dealing a burst of nature damage and applying a 5-second dot. Make sure to mitigate these strikes. His most dangerous ability, however, is Virulent Pathogen. This is a disease debuff that afflicts a random player and lasts 5 seconds. During this time, the player will be slowed by 50% and takes moderate ticking damage. Upon expiring, the player will explode and leave behind a swirly. Both of these explosions will apply a new Virulent Pathogen to anybody within the targeted zone, so make sure to spread if you have the debuff. While fighting Lord Waycrest, Lady Waycrest will spam cast from across the room with Racking Cord. Ranged can interrupt this to mitigate outgoing damage. She will also spawn multiple zones via her Discordant Cadenza cast. These zones will spawn near players, so your whole group will likely have to move. Upon Lord Waycrest reaching 30% health, Lady will heal him to full via Vitality Transfer, which in turn removes 30% of her health. Doing so will also buff Lord Waycrest with Putrid Vitality, increasing his damage done and haste by 3%. The group needs to cause 3 Vitality Transfers before Lady Waycrest becomes active. Now you can simultaneously fight both while kicking her Racking Cord cast. The final trash we encounter after defeating the Waycrests are Gloom Horrors. They will periodically strike the tank with Shadow Claw, dealing a burst of damage, but will also cast Dark Leap, leaping to a random target and dealing damage and applying a 5-second bleed to anybody stood within 5 yards. Make sure to stay spread here. Finally, we engage Gorak Tul. Roughly every 20 seconds, he will cast Summon Death Touch Slaver, which will spawn an ad. This Slaver will Dark Leap to players dealing damage and a bleed, but more importantly, will cast a Death Lens, stunning the player and damaging them for 70% of their health if successful. This cast is not interruptible, however these adds are susceptible to hard CC like stuns and disorients. Players should hard swap to these adds to nuke them down before you get overwhelmed by these Death Lens casts. This is because every Dread Essence that Gorak finishes will respawn all dead slavers while spawning a new one. To prevent this, players can use alchemical fire vials that spawn around the encounter. Running over these vials will give you an extra action button that allows you to throw it up to 40 yards. These vials must be thrown on a corpse of a Death Touch Slaver to remove it from the fight and prevent it being resurrected. Gorak will cast Dread Essence upon reaching 100 energy. This cast deals moderate damage to the group but also heals all slavers to full HP. It also removes any CC on them and, as previously mentioned, will resurrect any corpses of slavers. Finally, you must interrupt Gorak's Darkened Lightning cast. This will deal heavy damage to a player before jumping to nearby players. But that's all you need to know for this guide, and that wraps up Waycrest Manor in Mythic Plus. If this guide did help you or a friend out, then please feel free to drop a like down below and subscribe to your boy. And until next time, I'll catch you guys later.